Welcome to our TMIT Global Research Test Bed webinar for August 2023. Safety of Rising Freshmen, Battling Failure to Rescue. I'm Dr. Charles Denham. I'm the founder of TMIT Global. I'll be your host today for this webinar, which is our 207th monthly webinar over many years. We're really blessed to have you today, and this webinar was undertaken really as a call to action because we've had so many crises that are going on threatening our rising freshmen to high school and our rising freshmen to college that we interrupted our normal program to be able to do this today. And so we'll share a few videotapes just to bring us some context.
We're getting word that Bronny James, who is going to be a freshman basketball player at USC, suffered cardiac arrest while at a practice yesterday. Let me read a statement that was just provided to us by the family. It says, yesterday while practicing, Bronny James suffered a cardiac arrest. Medical staff was able to treat Bronny and take him to the hospital. He is now in stable condition and no longer in the ICU. We ask for respect and privacy for the James family, and we will update the media when there is more information. LeBron and Savannah, the parents of Bronny, wish to publicly send their deepest thanks and appreciation to the USC medical and athletic staff for their incredible work and dedication to the safety of their athletes. So cardiac arrest while at a practice yesterday. Importantly and crucially, before we have any more discussion, resting comfortably, no longer in the ICU. Let's get right to CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay, you've now seen the statement. Andy Scholes, I'm told, is with us as well. Sanjay, you've now seen this statement. Give us a sense of what you see here, what this means to you.
Well, so he's 18 years old. Sounds like he had this sudden cardiac arrest. There was a very fast, it sounds like, resuscitation taken to the hospital. But as you point out, given the fact that he was in the intensive care unit but was then able to leave the intensive care unit and is on a general care floor, that is obviously the most important sort of headline there. Obviously, the cardiac arrest, what exactly triggered that, what caused that, that's what the doctors are going to be sort of investigating over the next several days. This is rare. We know that a few thousand people who are young athletes do suffer sudden cardiac arrest every year. There's all sorts of different reasons that can happen, electrical abnormalities of the heart. We know, for example, with Damar Hamlin, it was related to something known as cordis commotio, which is a blow to the chest wall. We don't know what happened specifically with Bronny James, but in any given year, this does happen thousands of times. Sometimes it can be a structural abnormality of the heart that was never really recognized until now. Wasn't recognized until someone actually first has a problem with it. It could be an electrical problem with the heart. Again, that was unrecognized till now. So we'll get more of those details, but again, the most important thing, thankfully, is that he appears to have been resuscitated successfully. And in terms of how doctors are looking at him now, they think that he is stable enough to not need intensive care at this point, which is also good news.
So this was a timely event. 1,000 student athletes a year die of sudden cardiac arrest. Also recently in the news, which really draws our attention to, this was a cheerleader as well as another basketball player just in the last month.
For Michelle and Scott Donahue,
always wanted to befriend anyone and everyone.
There is no greater loss than their 16-year-old daughter, Callie Marie Mitchell.
She left for cheer camp on a Monday, and she was super excited.
Her mother will never forget the moment the cheer coach called from the camp they were attending at Texas A&M.
She called me and said, "Hey, does Callie have trouble waking up in the morning?" I was like, "No, never."
Her parents jumped in their cars and drove to College Station. When they got there, they learned that same coach had performed CPR on Callie.
If it wasn't for Eberly, we would have never had the chance to say goodbye.
Callie was airlifted from College Station to Texas Children's in Houston. She died on August 1st.
Probably was a cardiac arrest that happened first. That was caused from long QT syndrome.
It's a genetic disorder that affects the electrical system that controls your heart.
If this for any other parents out there, I know they do physicals every year. EKGs are not part of a physical. Get an EKG.
Their daughter, who started out cheering at the age of 2 for her brother's Little League team, never did.
What did Callie teach you?
Faith.
Faith, for sure.
And even on Instagram, she took a stand for what she believed. Her parents want her to be remembered for the last words she wrote. His plan over mine.
More than anything, she would want them to have faith in God and know that they are redeemed.
Grace, those parents speaking tonight, but what do other parents need to know to prevent this?
Mia, there's actually been legislation passed. It's called Cody's Law. The governor signed it in 2019. It requires parents to be given the option to get EKGs on their student athletes. And Callie's parents tonight tell us they're also doing genetic testing on their other children as a precaution.
So this has been a very important area for us in our MedTech program, which we'll get into a little bit later, but we led a program with cardiac screening of 55 young people and adults on June 30th of this year. 55 were screened, 7 were abnormal, and 3 were seriously abnormal. Also, as you all know, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen just a terrible series of events on Maui, and this is why it is so critical that our rising freshmen, rising seniors really understand the FEMA guidelines for families, especially when they go off campus.
More than 2,700 structures have been destroyed, most of them homes. Residents desperate to get back. The cause of the blaze is still under investigation. Videos shot from the water show both how bad the fire was, but also how strong the wind was blowing.
We're in the ocean.
19-year-old Noah Tompkinson and his 13-year-old brother Milo spent hours in the water, along with their mother, escaping the flames.
It's all right.
At one point, their mother started to get cold.
We kind of like all huddled around her and just wanted to like keep her warm. Has your mom talked to you guys and thanked you for being by her side? We didn't save her, she also saved us. If any of us were alone, I don't know if we would have made it.
So this is why a checklist that we'll be sharing with you for our rising freshmen and rising seniors is really important. The CDC has undertaken a study linearly over time, and this short video kind of addresses the issues, but unintentional injury deaths have risen dramatically, and these are areas that we can really address. To be a global leader in campus safety, you must address what the CDC defines as the leading causes of unintentional death and harm through student years, and for staff and faculty in their workforce years. These causes have exploded over the last decade. So this is why we have an initiative with our campuses of both high schools and colleges today. It's critically important that we understand these leading causes of death. Now, we've been studying these. The data from the CDC shows the top causes of unintentional death, which you see in a linear graphic, and you can see the enormous number of motor vehicle, opioid, drowning deaths. And so on the left, we see the preventable deaths most commonly in our students, both high school through college. But then what about the workforce years, our professors, our leaders, our educators, and our caregivers? So the safety of our rising freshmen is really an issue of battling failure to rescue. We know that our infrastructure for public health and public safety has been stretched beyond measure through the COVID crisis, and it's really time for us to step up and address these issues. As we look at the issues that are really threatening our high school students, so the rising freshmen into high school, as well as our rising freshmen to college, are motor vehicle accidents. So many of them are substance related: alcohol, THC, nicotine poisoning. The opioid overdose is an absolute crisis. We have Dr. Boats addressing this just in a few minutes, and the counterfeit pills, fentanyl, xylazine, which is called Trank, which is refractory to Narcan, drowning. is an enormous problem, especially for our younger kids, but also in the top 5 for our students, both high school and colleges. And then falls. And these falls can be related to recreational activities and risk-taking, but also substances as well. And we have an exploding problem of suicide, especially in our young females. And so these are critical issues. So what we did was we put together this webinar as a call to action on short notice, because our rising freshmen are just returning to school now, and we have been really called to action to help with that. So we have a number of speakers today, and a number are recorded. You may, for those of you that are on the podcast, you can go to www.safetyleaders.org to download the slides and also to watch additional videos. We've got a great panel that will speak. Now, we always start our programs with the words of our patient families. Jenny Dingman is one of our terrific leaders. She's the founder of Pulse, which is focused on patient safety. She's an accomplished speaker. She's an accomplished public advocate for patient safety, been a number of federal panels. She was one of my co-authors of the patient safety section and patient awareness section of the National Quality Forum Safe Practices. And she's also a winner of the Pete Conrad Global Patient Safety Award. So we always go with our videos with the voice of the patient or the families.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Denham. I'm looking forward to today's webinar. This is so important for parents of children who are starting college and even high school. The information here today is so valuable. I encourage everyone to please share the recording with your colleagues, friends, and families. I'm anxious to get started, so I'll hand it back to you, Dr. Denham.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. And we're so appreciative of Jenny's steadfast support of patient safety. Now, not only Jenny will be a reactor, but we have probably the world's leader in active shooter events and threats, multiple threats to safety. And our MedTech program is actually a result of a conversation we had in 2015 with Michael Dorn, former police chief, former leader of campus safety, written more than 20 books, best-selling author, but more importantly, probably the leading witness in a number of lawsuits that pertain to active shooter events. And you'll hear a lot more from him. We have a long interview with him. Joel Hausman is the husband of Nanette Hausman, has spoken to our audience before. They've championed the cause of a federal bill to have universities be transparent about the non-crime related deaths. We have Randy Steiner, who's the head of emergency response and preparedness at the University of California, Irvine. John Nance on our extended play session will have comments for a former captain with one of our major airlines, JD, and one of our leaders in patient safety. We have Chief Bill Adcox, who's the chief of police and the chief security officer at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. And we have Dr. Gregory Boats, who is an ICU and anesthesia doctor, both at the University of Texas at MD Anderson. And today he's actually at Stanford. He's an adjunct full professor at Stanford, and he is teaching today. So we have a recording of him regarding some of the substances that are critical issues. For those of you that are with us for the first time, you can get community, you may receive the continuing education documentation necessary for CEUs for nurses, CME for doctors, and the graphic you see before you is our learning management system, not an accredited university, but like a lot of corporate education programs, we call it CareU, and we cover a lot of topics. Today we'll cover just at very high level the Stop the Bleed, the American Heart Association, CPR, AED areas and others, but we're trainers there. For those that are with us for the first time, over the last almost 40 years, we have been providing these free webinars, and our network has grown to 3,100 hospitals and 3,000 communities. We have 500 subject matter experts that are all volunteers, and we call on them to help us develop our content. A lot of the content we covered today, if you wanted to dig down and read, we have 6 articles in Campus Safety Magazine, and we have 4 more forthcoming, and they will help kind of fill in some of the blanks. Now, over the COVID coronavirus crisis, we developed more than 30 90-minute programs, and we became kind of the training program for a lot of the universities that had to shut down their continuing education. So we provided programs for nurses, doctors, caregivers, and the 17 essential critical employee areas where our transportation, finance, defense department, they all had to keep working, even though that many of us were shut down. We do have a modest presence on social media, and we intend to grow that. And that's on slide number 22 for those of you that are in the podcast. Just a brief focus on our purpose, mission, and values. Our purpose is we will measure our success by how we protect and enrich the lives of families, patients, and caregivers. Nothing more important than our youth, and that's why today's webinar is a perfect fit there. Our mission is to accelerate performance solutions that save lives, save money, and create value in the communities we serve and the ventures we undertake. And our core values, we learned a lot from Ed Rhodes, the co-founder of JetBlue, who taught us the fundamentals of the DNA of our core values. And we established our core values, try to live them every day. Do we fail? Sure, but we do our best to focus on them. We use the mnemonic I care, integrity, compassion, accountability, reliability, and entrepreneurship. We do our best there. Our disclosure statement for those of you that are on the podcast is on slide 24. If you go back, none of our speakers today, either recorded or live, have any thing to disclose, and no product or service, healthcare product or service from the device or pharmacy or pharmaceutical area will be discussed. And we do not and have never received funding for this program over 40 years from pharmaceutical or device companies. That brings us to our emerging threats community of practice. For those on the podcast, we have a graphic that shows this program. We started actually about a year and a half before the COVID crisis struck, and we focused on what are the areas that our leaders of healthcare institutions, and we expanded it to higher education. What are they keeping them up at night? Where do they need to learn more about the threats that threat both those they serve and those who serve? We identified now 30 of these areas, and one of them are what we're covering today, which is harm to preventable death and severe injury to those we serve. So on the slide before those that are watching on the video, preventable death or severe injury was one of the areas that we identified long before COVID. So we've been focused on that. Now, over the last 3 years, we've undertaken a study of more than 1,000 households. What's a household? That's a family unit, or it could be college students who are living together as a living unit offsite at their university. And so we had both, and we've studied this and focused on the head, heart, hands, and voice. What do they need to know? What do they need to feel? What do they need to do? And what do they need to tell others once we learned what we needed to focus on? And our focus area were the 5 R's of safety. We're going to come back regarding family safety plans as it relates to our rising freshmen in both high school and college. Today is our introductory sort of focus. It was a quick call to action because there are so many preventable deaths and harm to our young people. And the focus is on how can we be ready? Readiness. The second R is response. How do we respond to emergencies? Third is rescue. Failure to rescue is the problem. The solution is bystander rescue care. How do we help our family members or our loved ones or our friends recover? And then resilience is the final R, which is how do we do what the military and what law enforcement says is target hardening? How do we harden the target of our family? And so we go through this detail. We'll provide a more detailed program. This is just introductory for you all. I won't read the slide, but I've just given you kind of a brief summary of what readiness, response, rescue, recovery, and resilience is about. So in 2015, we developed a program called MedTech. It merges the best medical best practices and the best tactical practices for what you can do before EMS arrives, focused on bystander rescue care. The problem is we have many, many people who pass away before EMS arrives. What can we all do as non-medical people? And so we've been focused on a number of areas over the last year for many of our medical centers and our universities on insider threats and a number of the more sophisticated, complex areas. But on the graphic you see before you and those on the podcast, we have the depiction, a picture of an iceberg. And under the waterline, these are really, really critical issues. There are 8: cardiac arrest, choking and drowning, opioid overdose, anaphylaxis, life-threatening allergies. Major trauma, such as bleeding after active shooter events, common accidents, transportation accidents, and bullying. So as we look at these issues, these are the problem that we find, and the solutions are bystander rescue care. What do we need to do to rescue others? And these are non-medical. These are what can bystanders do. The critical issue is that in the first 3 minutes, if you can act on helping someone with one of these problems, you are going to save lives, maybe 3 to 7 times the number of lives that can be saved if you wait for EMS. Average response time is 8 to 12 minutes. In Hawaii, we know the response time was shut down totally. We know on Oahu, for instance, that the response time, because of the roads and the infrastructure, much longer. So we know in urban areas it might be 8 to 12 minutes, average in 10. We have 10% diminishment of survival with every minute. So typical survival after EMS arrives is about 11% for sudden cardiac arrest. And yet we can have an enormous impact if people know CPR and how to use an AED. So we really, really are going to drive that home. We're going to show a graphic of a checklist for our rising freshmen and recommend that everyone learn CPR, how to use an AED, and stop the bleed. Major trauma is absolutely critical. We know people can bleed out in 3 to 5 minutes. And so for those on the podcast, we'll also address this. So we have put up on the screen, and I'll read it very, very quickly so we can move to our speakers, but we've created a checklist for high school freshmen, a checklist that they could focus on, and one for college freshmen. They're almost identical, although there's something that's very, very different about college students. So let's talk about high school freshmen. The basic actions they need to know is how to make a 911 call and on their phone automatically have their in case of emergency folks called. Most people don't realize that on any of the iPhones and the Androids and the other phones that are available, that you can actually program when you dial 911, your parents or your in case of emergency guardian can be called. Everyone should know where the local hospitals are and the level 1 trauma centers are for very serious things. You wouldn't go to an urgent care center, you'd go to a major medical center. The third point on basic actions is every family should review the FEMA checklist for disasters. One quick tip, you should have somebody who you can call outside of the state, outside of your state, so that if the cell phones go down, as they did in Maui, that you could, if you could get on a landline, you could call somebody somewhere out of that geographic area and find your loved ones. If everybody knew to call Uncle Joe and you have Uncle Joe's phone number, you could coordinate finding each other when the cell phones are down and the internet is down. What about sudden cardiac arrest? Consider everyone getting cardiac screening. This is an area in public health that's kind of controversial because we say, well, the whole population shouldn't be screened. But listen, for $85 to $100, you can have your child or your athlete get an EKG and a 2-view ultrasound. My son's life was saved because we did that. And that's why we champion that cause. And so we really believe in that. Everybody should have CPR AED certification and have an AED if one can afford it for your family. Choking and drowning. Again, my son had a choking event last summer. Had I not been teaching Heimlich maneuver with our program, I don't think I could have been able to dislodge a piece of steak that was caught in his airway. It took back blows and it took more than 3 very strong Heimlich thrusts to dislodge it. And my son knew that he would die. He said, "Dad, you really did save my life." Life-threatening allergies from venom, in insects, and from venom from meds and food allergies. Everyone needs to know how to use an epinephrine auto-injector. There are 4 different types. We have a video that's posted on our website you can watch to learn more about that. We don't have time today. Critical thing that everybody really know that. The other critical thing is every kid that has a life-threatening allergy should have both of their auto injectors with them, not leave one at home and one in a backpack. 50% of the hospital admissions to EDs happen because they only had 1 dose. And many kids forget having them at all. Opioids and poisoning, we'll hear from Dr. Boats. Counterfeit pills, 50 million pills were seized this last year. 60% of them had a lethal dose of fentanyl. And these are counterfeit pills that look like real ones. THC poisoning, totally on the rise. Nicotine poisoning from vaping, you'll hear more about that. Vaping dangers, how to use Narcan, and rescue skills. Every freshman should know how to do this. It's just so common. Now, major trauma, active shooter events are pretty rare. However, car accidents are very rare, very common. And we know in my son's chosen area of competition in surfing, we've lost a surfer just in the last 3 weeks from a fin cut on their femoral artery and bled out at a remote location. Very easy to teach. We've tested it. We've studied it. 5th graders and above. Easy to train how to use tourniquets, wound packing, and pressure. Great evidence to support the American College of Surgeons Stop the Bleed program. Understanding concussions. This is evolving. We've seen this evolve even in the last year. Can't cover it right this moment, but every kid should understand it, and everyone should know what a concussion and multiple concussions can do to the long-term development of our youth. Infections. We have a program called Clean a Cut, Save a Life. You can watch a video regarding that. There are terrible bacteria that are much more aggressive and resistant to antibiotics. And so we talk about to kids about tell an adult if you have a cut, wash it out with soap and water, not hydrogen peroxide or alcohol. And if it hurts more the second day than it did the first, see a caregiver. You may have an evolving infection that could turn into sepsis and take your young soul. COVID, flu, and pandemics. Controversial, I know. We've got the culture wars going on. I experienced COVID in the last month, very, very sick. I think just the principles of preventing spread of flu and our future pandemics, and if we had future things evolve, everyone needs to know how to prevent getting sick from someone else who you live with. Transportation accidents, 2 types. Non-traffic related drive-over accidents and traffic accidents that may be related to risk-taking and substance impairment. Every high school student, freshman, is going to be offered an opportunity to ride with a senior classmate. We have 30% vaping across our high schools. Drinking is at an all-time high in many of our regions. Critical. Bullying and suicide. Absolutely critical as well. And we have a real rise of that with our young ladies. It's really become a big problem with our teenagers, and we don't have time to go into the detail. Now, what's different about college freshmen? Guess what? They're all the same except for the basic actions. Everyone over 18 needs to have a medical power of attorney for their state where they live, the state where they go to school, and if they go on spring break to somewhere or anywhere, you need to make sure they have a medical power of attorney. You'll hear briefly about the Corey Act and about the death of one of our wonderful kids at 18, and parents were not called with a head injury, and this young person died in an emergency department, and the parents were not able to be reached, and the outcome could have been dramatically different. The 911 automatic call doesn't necessarily have to be parents. If somebody in the college town can be your in case of emergency person, you can automatically have the phone address that. And then finally, know your local hospitals at the college town. Where are the level 1 trauma centers? Where would you take a friend who experienced a fall, alcohol poisoning, substance abuse, rape? Where would you take them? And it's not going to be your urgent care centers. So as we go through preventable death and severe injury, we talk about the problems. We're going to talk about the reason we need to act. Our public and safety systems are really have fallen apart because of COVID. Why the medical centers and the educators and our families could have enormous impact now, and families need to step up because we just don't have the systems in place. And why now? We will be counting graves or saves with our college and high school freshmen. There's what's something called the red band. What is it? The red band is that first 6 months or year of our kids at college is one of the leading and greatest areas of cause of death. 20 times the number of unintentional deaths from accidents occur, 20 times the number from crime. So it's critical that all of us really understand this and focus on it. This is going to be an extended program today. Generally, we have a 90-minute program. I'm warning our doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. If you watch for 90 minutes, we'll give you 90 minutes credit. We're going to run a little bit over 2 hours today because we have such great leaders speaking to us. And so we have Michael Dorn speaking to us next. We thought we would have a 20-minute interview. We went for over an hour. We've edited a little bit because he has such great and valuable information. Michael is a former police chief at major universities. He's done almost 9,000 school assessments. He has done more investigations and been an expert witness on the active shooter events in the United States than anywhere. He does it globally as well. And he was one of the leading expert witnesses for the recent lawsuits regarding vaping and the dangers of vaping that have led to hundreds of millions of dollars of awards, which then will continue. And a lot of our kids and a lot of our families are just unaware of them. So without belaboring things, all I can say is that this is one of the finest men I've ever worked with. Everything that we've done in MedTech is really a result of a conversation we had in 2015, where he led me to these 8 leading causes of death. So I can't say enough about Michael Dorn. And he leads a nonprofit called Safe Havens International. Tremendous guy. And I know you'll find him to be really valuable. Michael, I just want to thank you for that wonderful phone call that we had back in 2015 when you helped lead us through the process of understanding there was a lot more risk to our students than active shooter events. And the great work you've done with Mr. Satterley and the others on your team were fundamental to us developing our MedTech program. And now I look back 8 years and the lives that have been saved I can directly attribute to you. So thank you for the great work you do, and you and your wife and your team and all the great things you do. So thank you so much. And thank you for helping us today. Our topic is the rising freshmen in high school and the rising freshmen to college. Parenthetically, as we look at it, our public health system is pretty fragmented, and there's a lot parents can do and teachers and schools could do. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir. And I appreciate the work you're doing. And one of the things just to mention, I was a university police officer for 10 years before I became a school district police chief. So I've got some, different experiences we've run into there as well as our work, for the last 20 plus years, globally. So, but I appreciate the opportunity. Glad to be of assistance whenever we can.
Well, as we talk about the 8 areas that are MedTech focus areas, and we just click through each one of them, and again, in no small part to us learning from you, sudden cardiac arrest is a big deal. 1,000 student athletes dying every year. We see a number of the stories that we're showing during this program. Critically important that everyone understands CPR, use of an AED, especially if you tie it back to some of the severe trauma events. Is that a fair statement? What would you like to add that parents need to know about their rising freshmen in high school and the bigger risks that they have, but also in higher ed?
Sure. The biggest thing is the public perception, and the perception of many educators and public safety officials often doesn't match the data. So, back when you called me, one of the things that you've done that's been extremely helpful, we've got a lot of data, Steve Satterley's data on his studies on the relative risk of death in K-12, but nobody had any really good data on medically related deaths, emergencies, unrelated violence. We've always felt it was by far the leading cause of death in K-12 schools, but it's not really been tracked. And people get really focused on active shooter. And I've worked 23 active shooter events. I'm working 5 right now. They're terrible events, but they're one of the rarest causes of fatalities on K-12 campuses in the United States. And it's a global phenomenon. It's not unique to the United States. There has been an increase in those types of events in recent years. But it's when you look at the data, not to undermine how terrible they are, that's an extremely rare cause of death compared to those type of emergencies you're focused on with your MedTech program. And then, athletic practices and events, from what we can tell, is the next for K-12 fatalities, followed by traffic fatalities, which I know you address. That's people being hit on school property in parking lots and drives. Then we get to homicide. And then within homicide, the active shooter events that get so much media attention and are so catastrophic represent about 8% of those deaths. So it's definitely not something to be ignored, but your approach is actually far more important in saving lives when you look at the data. And I've been in this field 43 years, and I've polled when I do keynotes for educators. I'll say, how many of you have had a fatal shooting or any shooting in one of your schools anytime during your career? And I'll get maybe a few hands go up. But if I say, how many of you at any time in your career have had a fatality from a medical emergency? Almost every hand goes up, so it's not leading in the news because it's usually one fatality at a time. But when you look at the numbers, it's staggering.
Fantastic. And so, we're recommending that every family gets CPR AED training. We're working with the American Academy of Pediatrics to try to drive that know-how. And I know that you're a Scout family. Your son is, and he'll ultimately pursue an Eagle Scout. My son as well. We had the benefit of being able to focus that. But many countries around the world require it, and many states require CPR AED training. So we're working really hard on putting rescue stations within 3 minutes from drop to shock anywhere on the school property. So as we shift gears to choking and drowning, these are very common as well. And we think it's critical everybody learn the Heimlich maneuver. And then in the older age groups where substances, but now, as you've done some great work in substance abuse in the high schools, the airway is critical. And there are a lot of drownings related to substances, alcohol, THC, even the nicotine poisoning. Anything you want to address there?
Sure. When I was in high school, we had a group of seniors cut and go to a rock quarry, and they were drinking, and one of the young men drowned. He fell out of an inner tube. He didn't know how to swim too, I believe. And then my older boy, one of his friends at school, some parents went out of town. These high school kids had a party. They had drugs and alcohol. He had no idea this kid used drugs. And I honestly can't remember what. This has been many years ago. But he apparently overdosed in the pool and drowned, and everybody else was somewhere else, and they found him in the pool the next morning. So, and I know when we moved out here into the country on a lake, our son was very young. And I remember that first year we were here in our county, there were 4 drowning events in just a couple of months, and so those are, again, very critical topics, and I do, expert witness work, and we get calls. I only take about 1 out of 50 cases, but we've had a number of calls on drowning cases at school. I had one in Florida that was a faith-based school, and it was a virtual school, and they had the kids come in from around the country, and they almost lost 5 students from a riptide. And the headmaster, I believe it was, who was a pastor, saved 4 of the kids. But one of the students, he had asthma. He didn't know how to swim. They did no screening. They had a lifeguard back at the school, but they didn't bring him to the beach. And, there was this death, lawsuit, it's just a terrible situation. So, these are the things that, again, you're not going to typically see them in the national news because they report the anomalies. They report what we want to watch, right? And we always talk about, blood and gore and those type of things that lead. But you have to be very careful because the things that kill most people are not the things that you see, in the media.
What a great point. Thank you, Michael, for re-emphasizing that. That is so important. You know, as we look at life-threatening allergies, we recently lost a young lady, a wonderful young lady in a local high school, which we cover in this program. And it's very important that people understand that they need to have 2 auto-injectors, not 1, but 2. Almost half of the emergency department admissions of somebody that has anaphylaxis is they used 1 dose and didn't get enough.
Right.
It's critical that they get seen by a clinician after they're rescued. So we're trying to make a really important point that if you're in a group gathering, who's got an allergy, who's got their EpiPen, do they have them with them, and do they have 2? You want to comment on life-threatening allergies? I know you see those in your schools.
I do. Yes, sir. And I just, as soon as you started saying that, I thought about a client we've got that years ago that, you know, very good school system, one of the best in the country, but they had some little girls out on the playground. I think they were about 8. And one little girl gave the other little girl a candy bar that had peanuts in it, and she died right there on the playground. And, you know, one of the things that we really focus on in our work, especially with things like the medical emergencies, bullying, you know, a lot of other things you talk about, is student supervision, to the extent that, you know, on our website, you know, we're a nonprofit, so we have about 50 free training videos. But while we were working this massive vaping litigation, where 1,500 school districts were suing Juul and Altria for the vaping epidemic and the damage it's caused to the districts, you know, it's one of the things about that terrible problem is it's a supervision challenge. And so we produced a series of 3 free training videos on how to improve student supervision to prevent vaping. But it's a very important point. And for parents, you know, if you go to your child's school and you see where they don't have good student supervision, I would say something about it, because the majority of the lawsuits that we get when attorneys call us, which is like weekly, we get lawsuits. And again, I can only take about 1 out of 50, but I'd say the majority of them involve supervision issues. So when you talk about like the EpiPens, it's also important that the staff be able to detect the emergency quickly. Same with sudden cardiac arrest. We've had that where they didn't recognize quickly enough what was going on. And then a related point is how fast we can get, you know, the injectors, the nurse, you know, AED to where it's needed. So a big thing for us, people focus on all these fancy, there's a lot of really expensive stuff you can buy for school safety, and some of it's very good. But the most important things to us are things like staff having portable radios, so they can immediately call and get the school nurse, get the response team, and get an ambulance on the way. Because if they go to this and they call 911, I know that sounds logical, but if I get on the phone and I call 911, typically, unless they've got, you know, different software programs, there's going to be a long delay before the nurse and the school's emergency team can bring the AED or the EpiPen or what have you and respond. So, you know, to us, it's extremely important when they can to have a portable radio, know how to use it, and then practice those things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Deliberative practice is we call it competency currency. And
right.
We're working with a number of the universities and the schools right now at placement of 24/7 access to rescue stations. And we're recommending AED, stop the bleed kits, pulse oximeters, but also EpiPens. And the laws are now allowing us, you know, to do that, which is really so critical. Our focus is 3 minutes from drop to shock for cardiac arrest and 3 minutes from gunshot to stop the bleed. And so that really brings us to major trauma. And that's where you and I started back in 2015 was, what do we do about active shooter events? And I was exploring it with you regarding the campus of the world's largest medical center, who said, hey, Dr. Denham, you work with all the hospitals, all the CEOs trust you. We're worried that we've got 160,000 students and doctors and nurses and staff within walking distance, and we could have 200 or 300 body count if somebody, you know, got into the wrong place and shot us up. And so you taught me so much about active shooter events. Do you want to share with our caregivers and parents what they need to know now and why it's so important that everybody knows how to stop the bleed, but also what we need to know about active shooter events?
I'd like to start with some context. So there's a lot of very bad information that's prevalent out in the media, social media. So again, I've worked 23 of those events in K-12 schools in US, Canadian, Mexican schools. They have existed since before the Civil War. We had 2 mass casualty shootings in 1891. One was a hate crime in, I want to say, Missouri. And it was an individual with a shotgun who shot, I believe it was like 14 children at a play in a community building because it was a desegregated audience. There were, African-American and white students there. And he shot into the children and shot, I believe it was 14 people. In the same year, there was a mass casualty shooting in Newburgh, New York at a Catholic school, parochial school, 5 children shot in the playground. So, one thing I caution people about is this concept like it's this new thing, or it's the most common thing. And, we're right now working through the State Department with the Brazilian government. They're having these events. We've worked with the Polish government. I mean, they're a global phenomenon, either shootings or in countries like China with the death penalty for possession of a firearm or ammunition. They still have active shooter events. They're very rare, but they have a lot of mass casualty stabbings. And when you look at the attack patterns in the United States, the second most lethal attack was a bombing and a suicide bombing at a Michigan school carried out by a school board member. And you look at these mass casualty stabbings we've had, of course, the shootings that have had more publicity. When you get into, Stop the Bleed and some of these other programs, that's one of our best opportunities. And Stop the Bleed, people talk a lot about best practice. Very few things in my world actually meet a best practice standard, especially in a court of law. Stop the Bleed has, I would say, the most proof behind it and data behind it for once you have an active assailant event, saving lives, reducing casualties, okay? Now, an important point that fits with your program is that what we call the window of life, and we actually focus on even a narrower window than you're talking about, okay? So what I notice in the shootings that I've worked of those type, and this is true of most shootings, they're over very quickly, or I would say maybe not over, but the people who are shot are typically shot in a matter of seconds, okay? So one shooting I worked, he shot 25 people in under 60 seconds. Most of the mass casualty shootings I work, I'd say that 75% or so of the victims are shot in the first 30 to 60 seconds from the time of the first gunshot, okay? So one thing that we're seeing is an emphasis on programs like Run, Hide, Fight, the ALICE program, and they are not working very well. They're actually increasing casualties in some of the shootings we work. And what we try to get across to people is that window of life, that's training and empowering students and staff to react on their own volition in the first critical seconds of an emergency. And that has a lot to do with minimizing casualties if you have an event, but also if you have an event, once people have been shot or cut or whatever the cause of the injury is, what you're talking about. Now we have people trained in hemorrhage control and they have the supplies they need so they can get to them very quickly, because it's really astounding. I'm a former police officer, and I watched a shooting by the police in Clark County, Nevada, and it was remarkable. It was a foot chase of an armed individual who was shooting at the police officers, and they shot him. And the officer who was one of the officers that shot him, within just seconds, this guy went down, he disarmed him, and I believe he cuffed him, which is what we're taught to do, because they could have another weapon, try to take your weapon. But it was blinding speed that this officer pulled out his tourniquet kit and saved his life. He had hit him in the leg. I think he had a femoral artery hit. And he was so well trained in practice, a guy that he just shot, within literally 5 or 10 seconds, he's applying a tourniquet and he saved the guy's life. And that is just, to me, remarkable, having watched people die in front of me as a police officer, gunshot wounds and other bleeding injuries, and the many cases I've worked where you watch it on video. And now we've got kids, scouts and students, who have those types of capabilities to, very rapidly use CPR, AED, rescue breathing, the, stop the bleed. I mean, it's just, I don't think anybody will ever be able to tabulate all the people that don't die from these. I know when AEDs first started hitting the schools, we would get, just so many accounts of where they put in AEDs and within 2 weeks, they saved somebody's life. We've had students in Alabama, a coach went down and kids saved his life with an AED that just been put in a couple weeks before. Conversely, just in the Atlanta metro area, about the same time, we had 5 deaths in 1 week from sudden cardiac arrest in K-12 schools. So don't mean to be so long-winded, but
You're so valuable. These are jewels. You're giving us diamonds right now.
It's just like I went to Israel for 14 days of training, and one of the things they told us is, if you set like your book bag or briefcase down and walk away from it, it's going to be very quickly some Israeli is going to say, hey, whose bag is this? And if nobody answers, they're going to say, okay, everybody move away from it. I think they told us the Israeli police get like 1,000 suspicious package calls a day because the public is so attuned to looking for that type of risk because of the terrorism they have. And they've done a really good job of training the public on how to prevent, different types of terrorist attacks. So, it's one of those things that you're probably not going to see much on the media unless it's something like the opioid crisis and they're giving you, how many people die a year. But when you do what we do, the 3.5 years we've spent as expert witnesses doing the largest assessment, a national assessment on vaping in schools, where our analysts went in and did basically a 4-hour assessment using 102 item tool at every secondary school in the first 5 school districts scheduled to go to trial out of the 1,500 that sued Juul and Altria. And I'll tell you, it was staggering working that for 3.5 years. In 2018, we had 27.5% of high school students in the entire country self-reported as current users of e-cigarettes, and over 10% of middle school kids. That's 5 million students. We have people forget we have 55 million kids in school every day. We have more kids in our K-12 schools than all the human beings who live in Canada and Australia combined. If you add the 9 million school employees, that's more people in our schools every day than all the human beings who live in the UK. And that's why I tell people our homicide rate per capita is probably lower than most countries. And I would say at least on par with or probably lower than in Canada and the UK when you look at the per capita population. But, when you step back and you think about those massive numbers, and then we look at all the overdoses we're seeing, 12 kids being rendered unconscious on a bus here in Georgia. And, they had to call 12 ambulances. They don't know what these kids have vaped, whether it's opioids, methamphetamines, THC, or it's an overdose perhaps from nicotine, which would be unusual with a mass, incident like that. 11 in Florida, right? So there again, you're getting into an overdose situation. So that type of training can be the difference between life and death, whether it's from vaping or some other type of overdose. And you've got somebody who's not breathing or their heart stops or both.
Well, Michael, you just beautifully segued to the next topic, which is opioid overdose and poisoning, because it's more than opioids. And I want to kind of go through those as well. But just of what we talked about here, we're recommending that every family get CPR AED training, get training on Heimlich maneuver, know what to do in a drowning situation, know about anaphylaxis and practice what they would do, and know what an EpiPen is and the 4 different types of auto injectors, and then stop the bleed. Everybody, because of car accidents, because of boating accidents, so many different ways. I mean, we had a professional surfer, which we're showing a video of, die of a fin cut, and he bled to death from the femoral arteries. So that takes us now to opioid and poisonings and the critical need for knowing about airways, oxygenation, how Narcan works, why it doesn't work for tranq, and this area of vaping. Take us through this whole opioid crisis.
Well, if you don't mind, I want to kind of go back to when you talked about drowning and make a point. So when I was a kid, we lived in a subdivision out in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't drive. The only job I could get would be to be a lifeguard at our subdivision beach or pool. So I think I was like 15, and I took the American Red Cross life-saving course, which the guys that taught it were very, very tough, and I failed it bad. I mean, I failed I think there's 9 rescues. I failed 3 of them. So, I mean, I failed this course, right? Just miserably failed it. However, 2 weeks after I failed it, my younger brother and I saved a guy from drowning who was intoxicated. And these guys were both intoxicated in a canoe, and they flipped it over. And the guy, very typical scenario, he could have stood up, but he panicked. He was in water up to probably this part of his chest, but he panicked and was drowning right there with all these people watching. And we saved him using what I learned. And then later, over the course of my life, I saved 2 other people from drowning, and I failed it. So, most people don't fail. I'm a diagnosed dyslexic, and I was having some great difficulty with certain physical things like running with the life preserver and getting the rope tangled up, that kind of thing. But, these types of training programs often work amazingly well. I mean, we see these instances, and you look at this and go, wow, this is really incredible that this 14-year-old kid or this 80-year-old lady or whoever it was that took one of these types of training programs and applied it, and somebody didn't die. A friend of mine's a professor, an art professor. He was in a restaurant with a doctor and his wife, and the doctor started choking on chicken. He did the Heimlich maneuver just from seeing the posters at the university, and saved him. And it was funny because there were 2 physicians in the restaurant, and he reacted before they did because he was closer, right? And I think I told this one time before. I heard a fascinating interview with Dr. Heimlich years ago, and they asked him how many people he had saved, and he said none. He'd never done it. But at the time they had, and of course, there's more of these that they don't become aware of, but at the time they had tallied like 10,000 people being saved. And here's this doctor that came up with it, and he's never used it. But he said, I've been in a restaurant before a couple times and seen somebody starting to choke, and before I could get up, some citizen jumped up and did it and saved their life. So we talk about, and I've seen a lot more death than most people would ever even care to think about, and not the type that you've probably seen most as a physician. Children dying in active shooter events and being run over by cars and crushed by items that fell on them, and all these horrible things. And it can really get you down if you don't keep perspective of all the many people who didn't die. Even in some of our worst tragedies. I was brought in after this shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And a lot of people don't realize, because that district encouraged their teachers to teach with the classroom door locked, though he caused terrible casualties in that shooting, he was unable to get in any of those classrooms because they were teaching with the door locked. So as bad as it was, that event could have been literally 2 to 3 times more casualties. So, even in those terrible situations, you think, well, thankfully, this horrible event wasn't even worse than it is. So, again, I'm just so grateful that the comprehensive approach that you're taking, because, you're addressing these things that we get these calls on, and our clients have experienced, that you're not going to see, in the national news most of the time, because it's not newsworthy when one child dies on a playground from choking, or anaphylactic shock, or a teacher dies from sudden cardiac arrest in the workshop, at the school, those type things.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to give you some good news. Although Dr. Heimlich passed away, we have a video which we're going to show that shows that he was in the retirement home. A woman was choking. He got up and walked around the table, saved her. And the moral of the story is that he said, that's the first time I've been able to use it. It's now saved between 100 and a low, more than 250,000 lives, and he got a date out of it.
He sounded like a wonderful guy. And this, of course, was like 15, 20 years ago, right? But you can see the difference in the numbers, because any of these, like Stop the Bleed, some years ago, it was very rare to see anybody in a school aside from perhaps a nurse. And now we have many districts. Georgia, my state where I live, the state of Georgia, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they would pay for Stop the Bleed training and the kits for every school bus in the state of Georgia. The Atlanta public school system, when we assessed them the last time, the lady that's in charge of their nursing program is phenomenal. And, she was going through how they're across this large school district, they're doing all this training and making sure they have the kits where they need them, and you look back at some of these shootings where people would have been saved. I remember the shooting in Texas at the church some years ago. A friend of mine, one of his best friends, was the first person shot in that shooting, and he was shot, with a rifle. And he was didn't hit the media. What he told me, the gentleman was shot, and then when the attacker came in, he stood on him and shot him 3 more times. He shot him in both thighs and both arms, okay, with a .223 Remington round. And he survived that. There were nurses in the church who did hemorrhage control. And to think, when I was a cop on the road, you wouldn't even think the person would have a chance, let alone, out in a setting like that. So, while all these things are distressing to think about and talk about, you could fill a major university with students, with all the people that have been saved by these various approaches,
Fantastic. Well, so our topic right now is opioid overdose. We've got
Yes, I'm sorry.
We have a pandemic of counterfeit pills that have fentanyl in them.
Right.
We'll let all the parents know about this, and study drugs as well, and this whole counterfeit issue with fentanyl. And now we have tranq. So we now have a sedative for veterinary sedative that is refractory to, meaning that naloxone or Narcan doesn't work with it. And then we have the vaping crisis, which you are probably world's expert on in terms of nicotine and THC and all the terrible things that are happening there, causing disruption in the schools. You want to help us kind of understand what parents of rising freshmen in high school that may not have been exposed to vaping and all of a sudden they are, and the kids that are probably picking it up as they're more independent and they're freshmen going to college.
So a really important point is, even with the media exposure and so forth, it is still very common for school officials to catch a student with vaping devices, vape pods, catch them in the act of vaping, and then the parent comes in and curses them out and wants them to give them the Juul or whatever device back, because they feel it's harmless, it's just mist. We still have people that don't understand that not only do those devices contain nicotine, but, and I studied this for 3.5 years. The firm that retained us had 30 subject matter experts, and these were some brilliant people. And I was just really amazed at some of these doctors and public health officials and mechanical engineers. One guy had 5 degrees in mechanical engineering. I think he was a professor in Lebanon, and he studied, he makes machines to help you understand if somebody inhales something in an environment, how much goes into the lungs and so forth. And so what a lot of people don't realize, so for example, Juul, they would tell you that 1 pod equaled the nicotine in 1 pack of cigarettes. However, the amount of nicotine that hits the brain is much higher, and it was very fast. I think within 10 seconds, and hits the pleasure centers in the brain. So that was the big difference when the vaping epidemic was declared in 2018 as an actual epidemic. People use that term, as you know, they throw it around a lot. So anybody that tells you there's a school shooting epidemic is not a subject matter expert, or they're lying. That's the best way to put it. As you know, there's a definition before you can call something an epidemic. For school shootings to be an epidemic, I think the data we ran, you'd have to have 15,000 school shootings in America in 1 year, more than we've had in the history of this country, for that to be actually an epidemic. However, with vaping, it was declared, and the data is very clear based on the percentage of people that have to be addicted or use, for it to be an epidemic. So in 2018, the data that I talked to you about, and the Surgeon General specifically called out Juul as the only company, I think, that he actually named, because the allegation, the suits, was that they designed the device specifically to addict youth and market it to youth. Now, a lot of that was helped by other experts, but I'll just say the information I read, it was quite compelling about how addictive this is. So, after I testified, in the deposition, Juul settled for $700 million, the largest, that's the biggest school safety litigation to date in the U.S. After I testified at trial, where Altria went to trial in San Francisco, that evening they called for a settlement conference, and I think they settled, it was a $92 million lawsuit by San Francisco Unified, and they settled for, I think it was something like $254 million. So we're talking $1 billion in settlement. I think the next day, Altria's valuation dropped by something like 12 billion. So these companies got hit very hard, but
Altria owns the tobacco.
Yes.
So Altria actually owned a certain percentage of Juul.
Correct.
They were both named, and so we've got the tobacco guys back kind of in our youth.
Yes, sir. And so Altria, is the biggest tobacco company in America. They invested in Juul, and if I remember this correctly, they gave them marketing advice, positioning in the stores, and so forth. So the primary litigant was Juul. And there were over 10,000 lawsuits against Juul. 1,500 of those were the ones that, we were involved with, the school district suing them. And so the hope was that the litigation, and I do believe it's helped a lot in terms of awareness, and it has limited what those two companies can do. They can't use the flavors anymore and other things. So, however, now you can still buy. What has happened is a number of the companies in China have made knockoffs using the same technology, the same approaches. So you can still buy those type of devices, the flavors and so forth. Now, a related problem that, speaking of, of course you can, as you know, overdose from nicotine. But what's more common, we're getting a lot of these where THC oil, not only are we seeing these, large numbers, 5 kids, 6 kids overdosing, teacher walks in the bathroom, there's 4 kids on the floor. They don't know what, they have to call paramedics. They're trying to figure out what these kids have vaped. We've had one case I read where the teachers came in and found 2 students unconscious. One picked up the device, handed the other. They both went down from overdose from skin contact. So, the related thing on this is marijuana use in schools has just skyrocketed, because now students can vape not only THC oil, but crystal methamphetamines and opioids in 5 seconds when the teacher turns their back. It's so quick. So a big message about all this: one, understand how pervasive it is. It is the single biggest school security risk that I have seen in my 43 years. And I know that sounds crazy to people because you immediately think school shootings. I've worked 2 active shooter events that 3 now, where vaping had a role in it. Okay. And what we're seeing is just massive tying up of school resource officers, security personnel, administrators. We've got building principals that are spending 40 hours a week on vaping cases instead of running their school like they normally would. One of the districts in Florida we work with, they had to add a full-time assistant principal and an SRO just to handle the vaping cases. I think they were calling an ambulance on average once a week for overdoses. So a big message for this is talk to your kids, make sure they understand how dangerous this is, how addictive it is. It is incredibly easy to get addicted to nicotine by vaping. Even with all the work that's been done, the devices are still out there. They can still buy the various pods. Juul and Altria, to be clear, never sold, THC pods, but they knew that people were using the devices and either modifying, putting it in the Juul pods or buying aftermarket pods. But to be clear, they weren't selling that. But when you look at the data, it is phenomenal. The state of Florida last year, they have what they call CES, or mandatory reporting. Every year since they came up with what offenses have to be reported to the state, fights have been the #1 incident, student conduct incident in Florida. Last year, for the first time, that was overtaken by what they term tobacco use, which includes and is predominantly vaping. And there were short of 15,000 fights in Florida high schools last year, and almost 30,000, again, largely vaping incidents, tobacco violations. And I point out to people, usually when you had a fight. Usually you do not know when a student vaped. A very small percentage of times that they vape do they get caught. So the problem is much worse than it appears. So talk to your student about it. And that's regardless of age. We are now seeing vaping increasing dramatically with elementary students. There's conflicting data for middle and high schools, but it is definitely still, I don't have a single client that's saying, hey, it's not a problem anymore. So make sure you talk to your kids about the dangers of it. Make sure they understand. You can easily now Google information from the CDC website and others to get, the facts and so forth, but make sure your young person understands how serious an issue it is. When two of the former students from San Francisco Unified testified in the litigation, I got to hear one of them testify, and he was saying that he's now 21 or 22, and he's got friends who started vaping at school in 2018, and they're still addicted to this day and fighting and struggling with it. So, in spite of the overdose risk, just the idea of being addicted, and by the way, there's so many chemicals that they use that the FDA, nobody's got research on what outcomes from all, especially the knockoff devices. It's like the opioids that you mentioned. They don't know what's in this stuff when they vape, even sometimes when it's nicotine. So I would just say it's one of my greatest concerns, and it is very difficult to stop. I will tell you this, I've got a very good track record of reducing weapons incidents in my school district that I was police chief in by over 90%. We were having typically 6 to 8 kids cut every year with edged weapons assaults and a lot of close calls for shootings. That was a lot easier to deal with than this is, because it is so addictive, it's so quick and easy to use, and it is just having a catastrophic effect on school safety. So go back to Marjory Stoneman Douglas. One of the things that caught my eye before we were brought in to work it, the vaping problem in the 1200 building and at Marjory Stoneman Douglas was so severe that they were tying up a full-time campus monitor just in the 1200 building. They had to lock the upstairs and downstairs, it's a 3-story building. They were locking the student restrooms on floors 1 and 3, making all the students go to floor 2 if they requested a pass. And they had to tie up a full-time safety officer just for vaping in that one building. Now, that's one building out of 254 schools and support facilities. They had 1,000 security people on duty at the time of that shooting, not counting all the police. And you step back and you, because nobody could really tell us, how many of these folks, it might have been 20, it might have been 100. So, then there was the issue of, them not being able to shelter in the bathroom on floor 3 because it was locked. So, it does correlate to sexual assault, to shootings, stabbings. When you see the drain on our school systems, it is just overwhelming what we're seeing in the schools. So be sure, back to, their individual child, make certain they understand the dangers, and they understand what's going on, because what's really striking is like the San Francisco data. San Francisco Unified had done a remarkable job, and tobacco use has just dropped dramatically across the country, but particularly in San Francisco Unified. They identified vaping as an issue many years before Juul came out, adjusted their training programs awareness, and they had reduced it. But in spite of all that, when Juul released their product in I think it was 2017, but it really took off in 2018. It just overwhelmed the district, even though they were really light years ahead of most on dealing with it. And it was basically the kids understood that chewing tobacco, that cigars and cigarettes, they understood that, but they bought into all the social media stuff that is just vapor, it doesn't hurt you, and so forth. And it's still out there. We still have a lot of people that just don't understand, including parents.
And as you said, they designed it uniquely to hit the pleasure center fast. I mean, that's what the engineering did. And one last point on the vaping is the violence and disruptive behavior with the nicotine overdose in the kids. What it does to the brain, you were telling me that it creates a pretty aggressive social interaction.
Well, there are a number of problems. And this, again, I'm reading mostly the depositions of the former student, staff, and the reports by the subject matter experts. But Dr. Bonnie Felcher, I don't remember her full name, but she's one of the top people. They had a number of really, just stellar experts. She's out of, I just went blank, the university out there in California that she works at. But she's done years of work in the addiction arena. Dr. Winikoff is another expert that they had, the folks at the CDC and so forth. And, a number of studies have shown things like the ability of the students to learn is disrupted, the ability to retain information. When they're addicted, they typically have a strong desire and physical need to vape about every 50 minutes. So one of the things that happens is these kids are asking for passes constantly. They're slipping out of class. And then they're going to vape. They're vaping, in the stairwell, changing classes. They're vaping, like 50% of the kids report vaping in the classroom. So it's very hard to deal with because the vape detectors work very well for in most indoor areas, but to put 6 to 8 in every classroom with a camera to be able to cover the space of a classroom, it's to do that. And some of the other things is $2 to $5 million a building, plus people to monitor these things and, so forth. I mean, and when you listen to these students talk about kids, just the constant disruption to the whole learning process, teachers having to leave because the child doesn't come back from the bathroom and so forth. So we had to do a lot of work to test the various technologies. One of the things that we came up with that's extremely helpful is something called electronic hall pass systems. Those are phenomenal, but it's such a pervasive problem. It's very difficult to deal with. So I would just say it is, it's just mind-boggling. I could talk for hours about all these things. Like one of the schools in San Francisco, they were setting the fire alarm system off weekly, vaping. It was setting off, some of the fire alarm systems will go off from it. And so now you've got an entire building once a week dumping out, and they lose an hour of instruction, right? And Florida, one of the schools down there, kids standing on a kid's shoulders in a middle school bathroom, they're hiding the vapes up in the ceiling. The kid moves the ceiling tile to get the vape device. He loses his balance. He grabs a pipe and it breaks. It was the sprinkler system, $55,000 worth of damage to the bathroom. I mean, it's just endless, all the things that we were seeing in these schools. It's just incredibly, I just, I think the word I used in testimony was catastrophic. It's just,
it really is. And so surprising. The other surprising area that you taught us back in 2015 were our seventh area is drive over accidents,
right,
not motor vehicle accidents. And so there's a two-part to that. There are the front over and back over accidents in the parking lots and driveways of the home,
right,
not even on traffic. And then when we combine substances to kids getting in cars with kids that are under the influence of THC or under alcohol or whatever, those are two separate threat areas. But address the drive over. This is something that was really shocking until we learned it from you.
And, I had, many instances of clients telling us about these terrible incidents. One of the more common is a parent running over their own child at drop off or pickup. Buses. One of the things you'll see is, I remember one from where it was, where a high school student dropped something. It went up under the bus, and she went up under the bus to try to get it, and the driver rolled over her. I remember one driver was trying to radio the other driver to tell her that a child was under the bus and people were talking, and she couldn't get through the other driver and watch this child, killed. And, so we do a lot of work with our clients on assessing traffic safety, student supervision, but, for the parents out there, and I will say the majority of those cases are at elementary schools, they're younger children. However, I tell people, I was just telling my son this, he's got his learner's permit. I told him, always assume the other driver is drunk, high, having a stroke, a terrible driver, on the phone, what have you, because we had a very severe gang situation in our community, and it got to the point where we had 6 drive-by shootings on city streets adjacent to our schools during school hours, not school shootings, but gang shootings right next to the school, which of course are quite a concern. So we were sworn in as city police officers. We were school district police, and we started doing license and insurance checkpoints near our high schools and middle schools at dismissal. And I told my son, when we first started, 1 out of 6 drivers, this is not pulling people over. This is, I'm at a checkpoint, you pull up and I say, I need to see your proof of insurance and license. 1 in 6 people we stopped went to jail. Okay. And these are DUI, driving on a suspended license, habitual violator, people wanted for murder, people wanted for drugs, different things, gun charges for convicted felons, drugs in the car. And what I'm getting at is most of these folks were, gang members and so forth. And I was astounded at the drunk drivers we were getting at 2:15 or 3:30, depending on his middle or high school. And I remember one guy, he said, he was driving a habitual violator, so it's a felony to drive a car, right? And he said, I got to compliment you guys. I've been driving like this for several years. I've never been caught because the city police and sheriff's department do the checkpoints at night. And if I see blue lights flashing anywhere ahead of me, I immediately turn, right? And he said, they don't ever do these in the daytime. So because we do them like they do, where you come around the corner and there we are. And I was just staggered by how many drunk drivers we were getting. But these are people typically with an alcohol problem. But we were also getting students, and we had one young man that was intoxicated. He cut school. They would go somewhere, get drunk, and come back to pick up a friend or for some other reason. And this young man lost control of his car and narrowly missed hitting people and went across 2 lanes, fortunately without hitting another car, and went through a chain link fence onto a football field. So, again, and you mentioned this before the call about alcohol poisoning, which is something I had never heard of till I became a university police officer. And I'll tell you, I failed the life-saving, Red Cross, lifeguard course, but I did pass. Back then they didn't have AED, but I passed CPR and rescue breathing. It was the last course, I believe, in the police academy. I graduated on a Friday, and then I went to work, if I remember right. And our police department was at the ground level of a building with the infirmary with a nurse 24/7. And my partner and I were coming out of the police department, and these guys come up and they're carrying this girl. I'll never forget. She's covered with vomit and she's unconscious, and they're carrying her, and they're all drunk, and they're going, come on, Stephanie, breathe. Come on, breathe. I said, she's not breathing. And they go, no. So I told my partner, call an ambulance, call the nurse. I started doing rescue breathing, and I brought her back twice. And then the ambulance showed up and they said, this girl would have died. And then I found out later it was alcohol poisoning. And then on another occasion, this was a fraternity party. And this second occasion was one of our better fraternities we rarely had trouble with. And I'll never forget this. They come up with a pickup truck with this kid in a wheelchair, unconscious. I don't know where they got the wheelchair, but he had passed out. It was alcohol poisoning. And luckily they were ROTC cadets, and they had done rescue breathing on him, and, they saved him. And then he actually later, because of that event, became a police officer, and I remember him telling me about it. I just had no idea that you could die from drinking too much. So, a lot of people aren't aware of these things. And that, again, is why, what we call the comprehensive all hazards approach is so important. We don't just focus on what's in the news. We look at all that data and look at what is killing people and causing, serious life altering, injuries and so forth. So again, sorry to take so long with these stories. I just think it helps people remember the points.
So vital. And that's why I think the integrated approach we've taken of the brain, the heart, the lungs, they all work together, and all these different catastrophic things that can require what we call bystander rescue care. We always say the heart of the matter is the heart of the matter, right? You got to, the heart's moving the oxygen around in the blood, and it's got to go through the lungs, and you got to keep the brain working. And so, no, I think this is absolutely vital to be able to address this. This is why rising freshmen, it's so important that they understand what's going to happen when they hit high school. And so many kids have had the independence of somebody threw the car keys at the kid, and all of a sudden people are drinking at a party, and they're a freshman, and it's funny to watch a freshman get drunk, and they have no idea what that means. So that's helpful. The last topic really is bullying and suicide together. We know there's kind of a continuum. We know that social media is causing terrible isolation, outrage porn. We call it outrage porn. The things that are most sticky for people to watch are things that make them more depressed if they're depressed, or make them, more outraged, or there are so many addictive things that are really focused on our kids these days. And so can you help us understand, cyberbullying, bullying, and then the whole suicide continuum?
Yeah, so my backstory. So, I had a very troubled childhood. I was raped when I was in the second grade by two teenage boys, not at school, but in the woods near my home. We lived in New York. We moved to Alabama, and the bullying was very severe. Fortunately, a teacher there recognized that I couldn't read or tie my shoes. She pushed, and at first they wouldn't test me for disabilities because we had not lived in Alabama for a year. And she pushed. I was tested, diagnosed with dyslexia. My parents were told I would never finish high school, never learn to read on an adult level, but the same teacher pushed to get me a 2-week, a scholarship to a 2-week program for dyslexic children at George Wallace Junior College. And I was reading college level by 5th grade. I still can't tie a necktie. I have to it drives my wife and son nuts, but I have to use a calculator to calculate a lunch tip. I can't do math. And so it's, I tell people it's a gift in some way. That's how I've written 28 books. Now that I know how to read, I read voraciously and I can write voraciously. But, the bullying was, I tell people this, I can't speak for everybody, but I have been raped and I have been bullied. And in my particular case, the bullying was so severe, it was much worse to me than being raped. I mean, it was that bad. And I would say that from the 7th grade until not long before I graduated, I thought about killing myself almost every day. I was very depressed, barely crawled out of high school, was very blessed, though, to become a police officer at the age of 18 at Mercer University, where back then you could go to school free. I still didn't want to go because I hated school so much, but after 2 years, I started taking classes. I graduated 12th in my class. I've got a bachelor's and a master's, all because of that teacher in Dothan, Alabama, people at the Boys and Girls Clubs, priests, Boy Scout leaders, all those other adults that impacted me. And a couple of points I make to people is that, and I will say you got to be careful because I'm on my 3rd federal civil action where the plaintiffs are alleging suicide and they're alleging school officials being, at least a contributing factor. Typically the allegations involve bullying and a failure to do proper suicide screening and training. Okay. So you go back to Steve Sadley's data, and I was a little stunned at this. So the Justice Department data indicates that twice as many people die from suicide. Now that's staff and students on K-12 campuses are killed by active shooters, not murdered, but killed specifically by active shooters, twice as many. That's suicide at school. I can tell you that, I'm not, for example, a suicidologist, so I don't get as many calls on those cases probably as a lot of those folks do. But lawsuits against school districts and especially non-public schools that don't have qualified immunity, alleging a relationship between bullying at school and suicide are very common. Now, I will tell you, the first 2 cases I worked, and when you're an expert witness, you're hired by one side, but your obligation is to the court. So it's very common for me actually to tell an attorney something like, well, I've reviewed your case. If you want me to write a report, I will. Want me to testify, I will, but I'll be the best expert. The other side didn't have to hire because you're in bad shape. Either they're a plaintiff or defense counsel. That's not what they want to hear, but that's my obligation regardless who hires me, right? I will tell you the case I'm working right now. I don't have all the information. For the last 4 or 5 days, I've read probably 3 or 4 inches worth of documents. And it is pretty compelling that case probably had a great deal to do with both of those things. Bullying, involving religion in this case, and also the failure of the district to properly train people, suicide screening, when they have, there were indications clearly that the young man talked about suicide, threatened suicide in different ways prior to the suicide. So, I caution people, be careful, when you see on the news that somebody committed suicide because of bullying, having worked some of those, they often look very different when you work the case. I will tell you, though, there are cases, shootings and suicides that I've been involved with, that it's pretty clear there's a connection, right? So one of the things is, you and I've talked about this, when you look at the statistics, suicide risk It is one of the leading causes of death for, especially high school age students, college students, and there are various differences in data and so forth, but it's a serious risk. On that point, and I want to go back to everything else we've talked about. What you're doing and what we're talking about are very important for parents to help protect their child. I also, we recently rewrote our active shooter training programs, or active assailant, we refer to it, for the largest web training company for school safety in the United States. And, we just updated their courses. We just wrote new courses for middle school and another course for high school age kids. And our active assailant training, more of it is about how to prevent it and how to recognize that an attack may be about to occur, not waiting till you hear gunfire, like Run, Hide, Fight teaches you what to do once you see a gun, hear a gun, or somebody tells you somebody's shooting. There are usually indicators right before an attack. So those are, what we call pre-attack indicators, Gavin DeBecker's terminology, expert in the field. So, we focus a lot on what students and staff can do to recognize students or other individuals who are on a pathway to violence, as we call it. And I will tell you this, I would say that the likelihood, in my experience, that if a youth goes through the types of training that you've laid out, the stop the bleed, the overdose, the CPR, rescue breathing, all those things, I would say that the chances that the average individual, let's say that they're 15 or 16, and they get those types of training, I would tell you that from my personal and professional experience, the chances that that person would go through life and live to be, say, 60 and not save another person's life, I'd say it's almost remote. I would say that the chances are better than not that they're going to save a life someday. So aside from having your student or your child go through something like this for their safety is very important. But I would tell you, like your son, and the other young people that, you've talked about using the type of training. And this is a conversation. I'm 62 now, and my younger son's 15. And I've been, hey, you need to do this CPR training at Scouts. You need to do Stop the Bleed. And I've got the tourniquets and all that stuff I carry in our vehicles, but I'm even, have been looking at buying an AED for my house. And I'll never forget when AEDs were very new to law enforcement agencies, putting them in patrol cars. The first police chief to put AEDs in his department's patrol cars and buy AEDs, it was very controversial back then. And I was teaching for a group called Law Enforcement Television Network, and I happened to be out there. They were taping my son and my older son and I about school shootings, and then they were talking about this chief. So, and he had to push really hard. Remember, this is a long time ago. And what did people think? You'll shock people with them and you'll kill people with them, all those, rumors and stuff that aren't true. And do you know who the first person they saved with an AED was? The chief of police retired. He was fairly young. I don't think he was even 60. He retired, and like within a week or two, he had a heart episode. Someone called 911, and one of his own patrol officers got there before the ambulances, used the AEDs to save his life. He was the first saved by a police officer in the United States, where they put him in the patrol cars and trained their folks. And, I think about that. I'm like, I'm 60 plus years old and I've lost some friends already. And so I'm telling my son, hey, you might be around when I need some help.
A good idea.
So
yeah.
I just go back to what I said earlier. I mean, if you have 1,000, 4,000 young people go through these types of training programs, it would be hard to calculate over the next 34 years how many, our earlier discussion with Dr. Heimlich, the interview I heard with him, at that point, like 10,000 people have been saved. He had never saved anybody. When they asked him in the interview, he said, I've never used it. He'd been present and seen other people use it before he could get to the victim. And then you told me it was like some 100,000 saves later, he's in an elder care facility and he finally got to save somebody using what he developed 30, 40, 50 years earlier, So I just, as much tragedy as we're exposed to, I just see these instances like those you've described to me around the world, where a school bus driver, a teacher, a custodian, a high school kid, saves a life. A fellow speaker of mine, He's a motivational speaker. He's a real good guy. He's in his 70s. And he was somewhere and he was presenting and he went in sudden cardiac arrest in front of like 300 people. And the building principal saved his life. And the EMTs came in and did a big piece where he had them all come in and recognize them saving him. And those are very common success stories that a lot of people don't hear about.
Well, so I want to thank you personally for your contribution to saving my son's life, because his life has been saved 3 times.
3 times, yeah.
Cardiac screening, because we made it part of our program because of sudden cardiac arrest. Last summer, I had to save him with Heimlich, and if I hadn't been teaching it through MedTech, that wouldn't have happened. And because he had done the rescue diver course with me and had learned how to keep his head in a stressful situation. We always say we never rise to the level of our knowledge, we fall to the level of our training. And I think the rescue diver approach kept him from losing his cool when he couldn't get air. And but I go back to our conversation in 2015 when I got you at your office. You said, I don't know how you picked today, but I don't have anything on my schedule. And you said, I'm really frustrated. Do you mind if I unload on you? Because no one's listening to me. You said, no one's listening to me about the things other than active shooter events. And I said, may I record it? And we had a 2-hour phone call. And I just want to personally thank you for what you've done for my family, but all the families that are touched by the work since 2015. And I just want to thank you, Michael. You're so dedicated, you're cause driven, and our country's a better place because of you.
Well, it's the same to you, sir. It's just a blessing to be able to interact with you, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. I hope this is helpful to folks.
So we are so very blessed to have a terrific live speaker with us today who will share with you his thoughts. Randy Steiner. Randy, if you want to turn your camera on. Randy is a leader of emergency response at the University of California, Irvine, a longtime friend and co-educator in our MedTech program. His son is an Eagle Scout. They're putting they're putting rescue stations around the University of California, Irvine. Randy, please react to what you've heard from Michael and from the perspective of somebody at higher education. But you also know that our rising freshmen in high school are many of the young people that you help mentor through your community service as a fabulous scoutmaster. And so you kind of see both the rising freshmen into high school, but you also see the rising freshmen at one of our major and great universities. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, that was a comprehensive discussion that Michael gave, presentation. That's just outstanding. He made so many great points about, just so many different topics. So it's hard to find a place to start with the reaction. But at higher ed specifically, we are definitely, at least at UCI, we're trying to very much expand our capability to head off events. That's really, I think, the key to all these. We don't want to be reactionary. I think that largely in higher ed across the country, that's kind of been the modus operandi, is wait for something to happen and then respond to it. And with the situations that have been evolving, throughout the country in higher ed universities, most recently the Michigan State and other universities, we're really trying to take more action to put both technology and programs in place to identify and head off these things. We don't want to arrest somebody if we don't have to. We don't want to stop an active shooting event. We want to prevent that event from ever happening in the first place. So I think just to reiterate, I think that all the things that Michael was talking about, that engagement and education is the key to this whole process. Is and we have a great opportunity, as in Scouts, is a great type of organization to do that, where you have people who are young and impressionable and interested in developing themselves into adults. That's a great opportunity to really talk about the truth of certain things and talk about what occurs with the use of drugs and what occurs with violence and the dangers of the internet, that kind of thing, or being pulled into these these different types of groups. So, engaging these kids is so important. And Scouts gives us an opportunity to do that, but not every, a very small percentage of the children out there actually, take advantage of Scouts. But there's definitely other institutions, whether it be religious institutions or educational institutions, where, we can really start putting that message across. And the preparedness piece is obviously very important as well. You had mentioned about our Stop the Bleed kits, that program that we're putting across with the university, with our training programs, and those kind of things. I've done in the last couple of years, working with our Anteater EMS group, which is our student EMTs here on campus, to get that training out there and to really get people engaged. And the more we see, it seems like we engage people in the community, the more interest comes to not just improving Stop the Bleed training or anything, but all kinds of trainings. I just had I got an email from our provost today, reaching out to say that a colleague on this campus has been doing research and is very interested in emergency communications, and seeing, learning more about what we've done from my end on campus, and having a conversation with what other things are out there, what other things we can do to improve that process. So that's a conversation I'm very much looking forward to having. But it's also the understanding this is a never-ending process. It's something that we have to continually assess and engage with, throughout time. We're just going to continue to have to, find new ways to deal with this, find different technologies, different funding mechanisms to get those technologies in place. And, but that being said, technology isn't the answer. The answer is engagement. The answer is, really speaking truth to young people as they go up, and not the truth that we want, but the truth that they need. It's very easy to say, okay, well, you don't cross your eyes or they're going to stick like that kind of thing. We can't have that kind of message. We need to find, the truth that they can understand about, the consequences of various things and various actions, whether it be drug use or, bullying or anything like that, and really, engage them at a level that they're able to understand. Not that we want to. Because I know when I lecture my son, his eyes roll in the back of his head and he's not hearing anything I'm saying. But if I sit down and have a conversation with him, it's much more productive. So I think, having those types of conversations, I think are very important. But I know that doesn't scratch the surface on what Michael, just presented, but that's a take on it. You're muted, Chuck.
So thank you, Randy. And I think if you can hang in with us for a minute or two, we're going to have Dr. Boats address some of those issues of, as you know, the reason that we did this webinar was because of it's a crisis right now. This has been a rapid response team approach. Those of you that we're a little over our 90-minute program for our continuing medical education. We're going to continue because of this issue of, it really is a crisis in terms of what's happening with our rising freshman exposure, especially to opioids, to tranq, which is xylazine, we'll hear about in just a minute, alcohol poisoning with hazing, and also substance-related car accidents, which is such a big deal right now. So we'll hear from Dr. Boats right now, and then we'll have you kind of react to that as well, Randy, if you could. He'll speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll cover that. For those of you that are on our extended program through the podcast or continuing education, we will give full time for continuing education. So we'll give more than 90 minutes for those that have attended the whole program. So we'll hear from Dr. Boats right now. I'm just going to share that video. He's actually teaching at Stanford Medical School today, and recorded this yesterday. So stand by and we'll hear from Dr. Boats regarding these issues. Dr. Boats, thank you so much for taking time with us today to address this critical issue of our rising freshmen in high school, our rising freshmen in college. Specifically, can you help us understand the threat of the materials that are put in these e-cigarettes, nicotine and THC, and then the counterfeit pills, and what our kids are really facing these days?
Well, I think that's a really important question. You know, as a father of a recent college graduate, I've gone through this recently, and I have a lot of concerns about the things that our kids are exposed to when they go to college. College is a great experience, but they also have, you know, the opportunity to explore things. And I think we all did that when we were in college. Just the consequences are more dire now than they were ever before. With the advent of e-cigarettes or vape pens, there is the capability to get very high concentrations of either nicotine or THC or other agents into the lungs very rapidly, which can cause very high levels of those agents and cause consequences. It's not the same as, you know, smoking marijuana in a bong or in a joint. These can be extremely high concentrations of THC that get to the lung tissue and get into the bloodstream, go to the brain, and have dire consequences. At the same time, there's a really very chilling effect going on in society now with these drugs that are added to a variety of different agents, particularly things like fentanyl and xylazine. In 2022, the DEA seized more than 50 million counterfeit pills in their law enforcement activities. Their estimation is more than 60% of those had a lethal dose of fentanyl in them. That means tragic events can occur. The idea that one pill can kill is a reality now. And so our kids who are very vulnerable going to school, who may go to a party and accept a pill from someone because that's what everyone's doing, could end up dead that night from that action. There isn't a second chance.
Can you address this trank issue? And you used the other name that it is used. Can you kind of tell us what trank is and why they cut it with trank and why it's so dangerous?
Sure. So trank is the street name for xylazine, which is a drug that's used in veterinary practice for sedation, particularly in large animals. Its drug type is an alpha-2 agonist. We use many drugs like that in our practice, especially in anesthesiology, but not in such concentrations. And this one was developed some time ago, but never found a use in humans because it was so unpredictable, because it was so dangerous. It's never been used in human. It never got the approval from the FDA, but it was approved in large animal practice because it's very effective in animals of that size. It causes a profound sedation. It can cause respiratory depression. The respiratory depression is not reversed with Narcan like opiates such as fentanyl or morphine might be reversed. And even more worrisome is it causes very significant skin injury. One of the other very concerning side effects of xylazine is that it causes unpredictable but very serious skin lesions. People that use xylazine even very early in their exposure can develop these lesions on their skin. The tissue dies. It doesn't get good blood supply, and it can get infected and is very, very difficult to manage, even with, you know, traditional wound management that we do for people with burns or other skin issues when they're in the hospital. These sort of lesions aren't very amenable to that kind of wound therapy.
So, Dr. Boats, you really were wonderful in teaching us the critical importance of the recovery position or the rescue position and why the airway is so important. Now, when we talk about our freshmen that might over-imbibe alcohol and might be at a party and be left unattended, either as a freshman in high school because drinking has really moved into the younger and younger age groups, and then these freshmen in college that have no guardrails and are subjected to hazing and other things. Can you address why the airway is so important and why it's so important that every freshman should understand the airway?
Well, absolutely. It's very critical because alcohol in excess and other medications that can affect respiratory drive or breathing can reduce the reflexes that are usually in place to help protect the airway from aspirating gastric contents or fluid from your stomach. If you happen to vomit material up into your stomach and you're lying on your back, it will tend to go down into your lungs through the trachea and cause a very significant lung injury. By placing someone in the lateral position or the rescue position, the fluid, if regurgitated from the stomach into the mouth, will actually come out the mouth onto the ground rather than down into the lung. And that certainly can reduce the very significant injury that can occur with an aspiration event.
Last question. We know that as our young people are now experiencing THC, depending on the state and how lax the laws are, the rules, but the delay in having an impact and the possibility that they might overdose waiting for some impact compared to alcohol.
Well, I think that's really true. I think the studies that looked at the toxicity of THC happened in the 70s and 80s when the concentration of THC in marijuana was relatively low. But now with the advent of commercial growing of marijuana and other products, the concentration of THC has gone up. And especially now with high concentrations of THC in things like edibles, there may be a variable response. Obviously, smoking marijuana gets the THC into the lungs and into the bloodstream relatively quickly, but by ingesting it, taking an edible and having it go through the stomach and the GI system is dramatically slower. But nonetheless, that concentration gradient will catch up with you. And we find that people who may take an edible and don't find that they have any sort of psychological or high from that, take more and then take a little bit more, not realizing that the peak effect by taking it by ingestion is a lot slower than by taking it by inhalation when you're smoking. And that can catch up with you. We see people in the hospital with very high levels of THC who have overdosed simply because they didn't understand the concentration and the amount that they were taking, and they have a very significant increase in their blood levels, which can lead to very significant brain issues like psychosis and other effects that are really, really not desirable.
What's your message to parents about their young people learning these medtech skills and being prepared for these emergencies? Anything you want to share with parents?
Well, I realize that sending your kids off to school is both a great opportunity. It's a great thing to celebrate, but it's also incredibly frightening that your kids are going to be exposed to things that you have no control over. And so by teaching them the knowledge and skills about bystander rescue care so that they can save themselves or others if necessary are key to imparting as much safety as we can into these kids that are exploring new things and learning new ways to live and enjoying the freedom of being in college, but also have the very significant threat of agents like alcohol or THC or fentanyl or other things that they might be exposed to in that environment. So it's not only really a really fun and exciting opportunity, but there's a lot of fear for what might happen to your kids. And I hope that by using the knowledge and skills of MedTech, we can arm these kids with some tools that they could use to make good choices or to help their friends and acquaintances if they find that someone's in that circumstance themselves.
Well, Dr. Boats, thank you for being our clinical leader and imparting such great knowledge to us that we can put to work in those first few minutes of an emergency. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are so blessed to have such great leaders joining us today. Before we come back to Randy Steiner, we are going to address something called College 911, which has been just a terrific opportunity for us to learn. We're so blessed to have worked with Nanette Hausman. You'll see on your screen, Joel Hausman is her husband. You'll hear from him with just a brief segment shortly. But the way that we met her was we met her after her son's story became a news story. An 18-year-old, a freshman, just a few weeks into his college of choice, had a skateboard accident with a severe head injury, and no one contacted the parents. And so he was in a small emergency room for some time and he passed away. And the fact that the parents were not able to be contacted is a big problem. And so they've started something called College 911. So let's just review what a rising, now this is the rising freshman to college, and Randy, we'll come back to you here in a sec, is an emergency checklist we developed in complementary to what Nanette Hausman had done. We added a little bit to it. Number one is everyone over 18 should have a medical power of attorney. We've created a checklist, which we'll finish up with, Randy, to go over. But college students that are over 18, no one is by law required to contact the, in case of emergency, people regarding their care. And if they have a head injury, you have a real problem. So medical power of attorney in not only the state where they live, the state where they go to school, and it would really be a great idea when they go on spring break or they go skiing or whatever, to make sure that whatever states that they're going to go to, that you have a medical power of attorney so that the parents or whoever they designate can make decisions for them. Number two is smartphone in case of emergency notification. All the smartphones allow you now, when you dial 911, to notify a parent, especially important for freshmen, young ladies that might be at risk on a college campus and they're afraid they can hit 911 and their parents will be notified as well. But all freshmen, especially if we have any of the crises we've talked about. Knowing the emergency providers and where your level 1 trauma center is. Randy, you here at UCI have one of the best emergency departments in the country. And if kids were off site and at a party and somebody got hurt and had a fall, they might think it's better to go to the nearby urgent care center rather than your world-class emergency department. And the final thing is that many of our kids, my son is an example, who had Wolff-Parkinson's-White syndrome. He had 2 cardiac procedures, ablation procedures. That needs to be in the record. Any life-threatening allergies. So these are the most important things: medical power of attorney, smartphone notification, knowing the emergency providers, and medical record access. So the original checklist that Nanette Hausman, who you see on this picture, championed with her husband Joel and in honor of her son Corey, battled lung cancer over the last year. Dear friend, and as a retired cancer doctor, my wife and I prayerfully supported her in every way we could, and she and Joel. These were is the original checklist you find on their website, College 911. Most importantly, though, they've also pursued having a bill, not only that had been passed in Connecticut, but now a federal bill, a bipartisan bill, to get universities to be able to publicize deaths and disabilities and injuries that occur, not just crimes, because it allows them to focus on improvement. And it's important to know that there are likely to be 20 times more deaths from accidental injury that we really don't know much about than the crimes. And so this is a shot of this bill. It's being pursued right now. And so, Randy, before we go to you, we're just going to hear just a short clip from Joel Hausman, and then Randy will be coming back to you. Joel, first off, we just want to express our condolences for your loss of Nanette. She was a fighter, and she fought for the bill, and she fought to protect the lives of college students right up until we lost her. How are you doing?
Well, thank you so much for your condolences. While extremely difficult, we're carrying the torch, and we're trying to achieve the goal that Nanette set out to do with her tireless effort, and we're gaining traction right now. We have sponsorship in both the House and the Senate. I believe the word is bicameral, good Scrabble word, and we have sponsors on both sides, both in the House and the Senate. And we actually had a news conference just the other day because a senator from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal, sponsored the bill, and we're now in Washington. And when the representatives and senators get back, it will be brought to the floor. I'm planning on going to Washington at the end of September to try to get as many people on board as possible.
Well, Joel, I just want to, on behalf of the country and so many of us that are supporting you and the bill, God bless you for just carrying the torch forward. You're one of our heroes, as was Nanette, and so thank you very much for all you're doing.
Thank you so much, Chuck, for all you do also. I might give one little plug for the bill, if that's okay.
Sure.
For all the listeners. In the Senate, it's bill number 2461, and in the House, it's bill 4903. So our efforts right now are to have everybody contact their representatives and their senators and express that they support this ultra common sense bill that will save lives.
Well, thank you, and we'll spread the word.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Chuck.
So we are so appreciative of you, Randy, to be with us today to comment on what we've heard today as we finish up. Love to have you. I'm going to come back to this to allow you to kind of be able to address it, but we'd love to have you address anything you'd like to add regarding these two checklists that we've put together for our high school freshmen. And you work with a lot of young people. I think you're too modest. You really are a great leader in our community there. And then our college freshmen, where you have a direct responsibility. And I'll come back to this, but I just want to remind everyone that Randy and our team are working together to look at automated external defibrillators and stop the bleed kits and rescue work. And we're looking at how we could look at a high school, how we could look at a college campus and be within 3 minutes from drop to shock. And we're just really honored, Randy, to be working with you, on these. So really two just quick responses. Anything that you would like to add regarding these checklists, and then any comments regarding how important it is to really get everybody educated regarding the issues of the 3 minutes and counting.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at these checklists. You introduced me to these a few years ago, and it's good that it makes me feel good that we're able to honor Annette's memory here at UCI, because we've integrated the concepts behind these checklists into our student parent orientations that we do at the beginning of every term. Emergency management here at UCI, we address the groups who do the incoming freshmen who come to their mandatory sessions, just to sort of orient our incoming freshmen. And we do address these, having the ice on your phone and knowing where your hospitals are and what the process is if something happens. All those, the medical power of attorney is a big one as well. It's really wonderful that we have the opportunity to get that information out to these students as they come in. And I encourage, any institute of higher education to address these, very commonsensical, practices for your incoming students. There's no harm in it. There's nothing that can be, it's not going to create any kind of problem, but it may, potentially save somebody's life at some point in time. So it's very important. And going back, that goes right back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of communication and education, starting this process, young. A lot of the parts of the checklist for, the high school students and, younger people, we address through scouting, through a lot of the merit badges and things that we do and activities, expanding that to the rest of the population that may not be involved in an activity like scouts, and making sure that at some point early in their high school career that they start learning these methods of protecting themselves that they otherwise wouldn't really consider. I mean, I know when I was in college and I first started, I didn't even know what a medical power of attorney was. We didn't have cell phones at the time, but I certainly have moved towards with my son, and he just turned 18, having those issues being addressed with him I think it is a big advancement. And I think we just need to continue the education piece. It's got to go beyond, these webinars. We can take that out to the community and really, give something of value to the young people and their families, the peace of mind, knowing that, we can't prevent something from necessarily happening, but if it does, that we have some safety valve in place to address it. So, I encourage, I love the work that Nanette started. I love the fact that we're continuing to move it down the road and to, make it more and more in the mainstream. And like I said earlier, I encourage every institute of higher education, every educator, every high school to look at these checklists and to implement them somehow into your policies or procedures to get this information out to younger people.
Bill, thank you so much for taking time today to help us understand some of the new issues that pertain to our rising freshmen in schools and high schools and our rising freshmen in colleges. First off, can you address your responsibilities at Texas Medical Center? Because it's not just MD Anderson, it's the University of Texas Health Science Center, and you have a pretty broad group that you're helping protect.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Denham. It's a pleasure to be here. We do provide security risk and police services to both institutions. We are part of those institutions. Both institutions have very high expectations, and so we have a very rounded model, the combined protection model. We use the 4 Ps. Particularly, we look at prevention. We put together technology, security, administration, and policing in order to meet those needs. So, again, with having the appropriate support in the community is very critical, and both institutions are best in the world, and that's what their expectations are, and we strive every day to meet it.
Well, we love the fact that you are one of our leaders in threat safety science, and glad you brought up the 4 Ps. So if the first is prevention, both primary, things not happening, and secondary, harm if things do happen, what's your take on preparedness? Why preparedness is so important?
Preparedness is holistic. It's universal. It's across the board. So it's just not your security, your law enforcement agency. It's all the incoming students, which we're talking about today. It's the staff, it's the faculty, it's the visitors. So you have to start with a well-rounded program that covers all bases. You need to have awareness, you need to have education, you need to have training, you need to have the drills and exercises to anchor that down, so that you don't just have competency, but you can make sure you have proficiency. At some point, you continue to develop these things so that you're current, you have currency. And so the really important part is having MedTech in place, making sure you have the appropriate equipment in place, and individuals on your campus, whoever it might be that newest freshman, or it might be a visitor with the signage, knows where your AEDs are, your stop to bleed kits are, where they can get help if there's any other kind of crisis or emergency. And so those things are very important to have those in place. And that's what preparedness is all about, but it's preparedness for everybody.
Fantastic. And then the third P is protection. And you helped us really understand the idea of moving upstream or left of boom, which is prevention and preparedness. What about protection now with our rising freshmen to colleges and high schools? We really know a lot more now about active shooter events, don't we?
We do. We actually do. Protection is again, it's multiple processes. It's kind of like the Swiss cheese analogies. You have to have different layers in place. So you need to have the environmental layers, which is lighting, it's your locks, it's your camera systems, it's your electronic security, those types of things. But then you also have to have a very good, solid people system in place, which is your police and security operations. And your police and security should be very well linked to your local law enforcement if you don't have your own campus police in particular, but even so, linked to your local. So the way we put it is that your campus authorities are going to be your first responders. And then you have to integrate the other response. But the issue is having the right coverage on your campus and having the right training in place and having your personnel equipped properly. and so that they can respond. So that's part of the protection. The other part of the protection is what we feel is equally, if not more important, and that is the part about having protective intelligence. That's the part about understanding and people understanding that you need to get in front of these behavioral issues. And the most important thing is when somebody's baseline is changed, and then getting the right people in place. And in our case, there might be student counseling for students. If students report one another to say, hey, this individual seems to be a little out of place. There's some problems, or they're saying things that kind of give me pause. Well, then let's get some help in there to get them before they go up that pathway of violence. At the same token, it's other things where people are threatening from outside, or where you're keeping up with what may be a potential threat coming to your campus. And so it's having the intelligence and having the mechanisms in place to put it together and look at it with a reasonable eye. Not everything's a danger. And if you get upstream, left a boom, and get individuals some help, I mean, that's critical. Because frankly, if you get the boom, we've all lost. Yes, you want to get in quickly with your protection model. You want to get in and neutralize that threat, but that means somebody's already hurt. I mean, something has already happened. So truthfully, it's having a holistic system in place and having it properly vetted, accountability, transparent, and most of all, have it properly resourced and have the right people leading it.
Fantastic. And then the fourth P is performance improvement. And it has been so great to collaborate with you and your world-class team to really study the other events and understand these threats that can really face our students. And I think it was pretty fascinating listening to Michael Dorn describe that fights are a real indicator of potential harm downstream, and the advice to rising freshmen in college and in high school to avoid the confrontations, the fights, the bullying, because the downstream events can be pretty lethal.
Well, that's true, and that's again where you try to get in front of it. You start to you try to see who's out of place and who's doing something that perhaps they shouldn't. And really, you need to move in and address it, but address it from a rehabilitative type approach. So I need to get in. I need to get somebody some help, and making sure that they can be taken care of. Making sure that threat program that you have in place is one that is effective, and it doesn't touch one type of student, or doesn't touch a different minority, or the females or the males differently, or whatever. So you need to make sure that you have the right program in place that has it's culturally based. It has a really strong understanding of what actions are of concern when the baseline. So if you have a student that's constantly very quiet, and then all of a sudden this student is just lashing out and getting really angry, that's you need to report that, because something's not right there. To get a counselor, get a professional in there that has the psychology, the medical background that can in fact see if there's a problem and see what we can do as a group to assist this young man or this young woman or whoever it might be.
So Bill, Michael has shared the concerning number that homicides on campuses have gone up. He attributes, as you know, the fact that the defund police, the vacancy rates in the communities have had a big impact, and that you have to carefully look at the data to really understand that the violence probably has gone up, depending on how you look at the data. Is that surprising to you after COVID?
Well, it's not surprising, but I don't think that one size fits all. I don't think that the defund the police is impactful in every community. I don't think that certain things are. But when you look at COVID and you look at all those things that you talk about, they've had an impact. For example, if you're talking about shortage of policemen, there is a shortage of policemen, and there's a lot less persons that want to become police officers. So the pool has gone way down, and then there are less police officers. Part of that is, for example, and people have not been talking about it, part of that is cities that implemented the drop program. So the drop program says, okay, you can retire, and then your money goes into a savings account, but you just keep working. So you're still occupying a slot, and you're still getting promoted. What that causes, it lessens the ability for others to get promoted within the organization. And at some point, this aging group is going to leave. So then when you start seeing anti-police stuff that goes on, and you start seeing a lot of the unrest in the communities, those older individuals in particular, they're able to leave. But you've never built up a supply of new police officers along the way in order to take their place. So now you have more people leaving and less people wanting to replace those individuals. And so you're seeing some really bad stories across the country. You're talking about dropping standards and allowing certain people with certain backgrounds to become police officers. At least you're seeing a lot of the talk about it. That may not show up right away, but trust me, it will show up. And we saw that even in some of these states like Los Angeles with the Rodney King incident. And when you did the backgrounds of the people that were hired under a real push to bring people in, eventually those things will come out. So it is a perfect storm. And there are some issues that are out there that need to be addressed. I don't think that we need to be in a panic. I just think we need to come together as a community and just work through those things. Another issue is there's a change in philosophy of many prosecutors across the country, not everywhere, but in particular. And so the change in philosophy, it might be second chances, it might be a different issue. There's some debate now over the constitutionality of cash bails. So that's going on and still being worked on. So people are getting out now that they weren't getting out before that had felony convictions. And trust us, the criminal justice organizations, criminal justice infrastructure is trying to work through these things. So you can't just throw rocks and say it's all bad. You need to be open-minded. You need to look at it and say, okay, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what do we need to do? Sometimes you might correct too far, and you need to come back a little bit. But we need to come together and not throw rocks, not become so partisan and divided that we can't get anything done, and that the great people that we've all sworn to serve are getting hurt. So I really think that we need to look at the issue as holistic and what's going on. But the truth of it is that the first responder net is frayed, and it is tore up, and we need to understand that.
And one of the points that you've helped us understand is that in certain communities, not all, but that the first responders as police may not respond to a medical call the way that they might have in the past because of the potential litigation, other risks, and that kind of thing, and why bystander rescue care and why the community needs to really step up and know what to do before EMS arrives, because whoever responds might be a little later in their response, and those minutes turn into graves or saves, depending on what you do. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I don't know that the police officers necessarily won't want to try to save life, because there are laws that protect them. But I just think that it is very true. We talk about stop the bleed, and we know that we talk about active shooter, which is probably one of the most horrendous things, particularly involved in our schools. But the truth of it is, there's a lot of individuals that are getting hurt with slipping, that fall. They get run over in parking lots at schools. There's major car and truck accidents, and you need to stop the bleed, because people will bleed out before they'll die. I mean, before they'll die from other injuries. So a lot of times it's just knowing what to do with somebody, whether it's to apply a tourniquet or to apply pressure or whatever it might be, until the EMS or someone else can get there that has specific training. But we can train the community in that, and makes these type of supplies very readily available for individuals. And you can use, a belt or other things for tourniquet. You can use other things to help out. So I really think that having people step up, bystander care is critical. MedTac is absolutely the 7 major causes of death. We know what they are. And one of those 7 major causes would involve an active shooter. So you can see very clearly that what's really taking the lives of our students on campus, percentage-wise and number-wise, far exceeds an active shooter. And so that we can all come together. So I think it's important that we teach that. I think that should be something that we all put into place. And remember, one size does not fit all. And so some people want to correct something by saying we're going to require every school to do X, Y, Z. Well, it might be helpful, and it may be damaging, because we haven't went to that school and see what their unique circumstances are and what their real risks are. So we have to be logical and sensible about it, but we have to do something. Doing nothing is worse than doing something. So I think that we all have to come together and do everything we can possibly to protect our children.
Well, Bill, thank you for that. When we listen to Michael, who is probably one of the world's experts on vaping and the impact in schools and has been an expert witness in so many different venues and has analyzed so many schools, I know I was surprised to hear that vaping is still about 30%. And that nicotine poisoning, because of the concentration of it in the higher economic areas, higher socioeconomic areas, and that cannabis-related products, because it's cheaper, we're seeing overdoses in that area. So this area of public health, I think we've not been good at helping parents understand how critically important some of these substances are. Is that fair statement as well?
Well, Mr. Dorn would know more about that. He specializes in K through 12. I'm in the higher education, academic, medical, but we all know vaping is certainly not good for you, and it's certainly very, very damaging. I think the problem is, it's just like when tobacco issues were so high. We tried to explain to people just how dangerous it was and how damaging it was, and it was, from everything from literature to educational programs. And that had a limited impact. And so a lot of times they're trying to criminalize some stuff now. They're trying to criminalize vaping and different things that go on. Again, I don't know that we should use the criminal justice system as a solution to social ill. So I do think there are some other things that can be done. I do think the manufacturers need to be held accountable, that we ought to come together and see what we can do with a cross section of people coming together, crossing lines at our legislative level, and see what we need to do to protect the children, because children are making decisions at a young age that certainly will impact the rest of their lives, and we need to certainly help them. We should be the sensible people. We're supposed to be the quote unquote adults, and so there has to be solutions out there. I think Mr. Dorn may have some in mind, but to me it bothers me. I have a daughter. Our oldest daughter is an elementary school principal, and she speaks to me often about the finding of vaping and the problems that they have in the school, and it seems to be a real concern for them. And this is even at the elementary level. So I can only imagine at middle school, junior high, and high school, it's probably very significant. So yes, we do need to address it. I personally don't have the solution, but we do need to address it as a society.
Well, Bill, thank you for all you've done to help us promote bystander rescue care. If you had the chance, because you're in higher education and protecting so many of those students and nurses and doctors in training, what would be your pitch to those parents that are sending their kids off to higher education on bystander rescue care, and why it would be so important for them to learn how to take care of their friends and be safer on campus? Your pitch.
Well, I think the pitch would be to make sure that your children understand how to perform CPR, how to understand when something does happen, how to ask somebody to call 911, give the exact address, how to properly call 911, and then also how to stop the bleed. And I think there's many programs out there with many organizations that will get them there, and to get them thinking about that they can help save others' lives. And even if there's an anaphylactic shock case, asking someone who has an EpiPen in the audience might be of concern. Sudden cardiac arrest, and making sure that they understand where the AEDs are, because as we all know, the AEDs are very, very easy to use now. All the instructions are on them. In fact, they're voice activated. They'll tell you. The AED itself will walk you through what to do. So telling our children and making them aware of just how to use an AED, how to perform CPR, how to stop the bleed, and how to call for help, and how to ask others to help you call for help. I think those things are critical, and if all of our young students know that, it'll go a long ways to saving each other's lives.
Well, thank you, Bill. And then the final issue is, it's an old issue, but it's still a problem, are the impaired drivers, and why it's so important now that we now have Uber and we have Lyft and we have all these services, why it's so critical that our kids understand, rising freshmen in high school and rising freshmen in college, why it's so critical not to get into a car with someone who might be impaired by cannabis, might be impaired by alcohol. We see see an enormous number of fatalities and long-term disabilities in our young people that are that get in the car with the wrong person.
Yeah, absolutely. Impaired drivers, DUI, DWIs, that's just horrible. I would tell you this. One of the things that I try to tell parents all the time, especially parents that are very, very responsible, they have a level of expectations, they have a level of rules and discipline in their homes. Most children don't want to let their parents down. Most children don't want to be found to be in trouble. And so they won't call the parents first for help. And I think it's very important to tell your children that at an age where they might be in a car, have gone to a party, be in a car where somebody's impaired, you just tell them, don't get in the car, make the first call to me, and we have a no blame policy between you and I won't even ask you about it. I'm going to come get you and help you. No questions asked. If you want to talk about it, that's your call, not mine. And that way, the child will not feel either embarrassed or that they're going to a lot of trouble and take the chance of getting in the car with an impaired driver. So they can do that. On the higher side is whether or not these students are going to be willing to call somebody, another adult, or maybe even the police department to say, hey, there's a young man or a woman or an individual that's getting ready to drive, and I think they're impaired. You know, I don't know if they'll go that far, but surely you as a parent need to have a relationship with your child to tell them that, you know, there's a no fault call to me. You know, rather come get you and you be alive, even though you perhaps made a bad decision. Even if you were drinking too, doesn't matter. I'll come get you.
Yeah.
You know, it's better you to be alive. And then when the parent gets there, they can come get you, but the parent may be able to intervene as a parent too. So I just think it's very powerful to make sure that you have that relationship with your child to where they know no matter what kind of a bad situation you get into, call you. Now, again, you as a parent are going to do everything you can to educate them, and hopefully they won't get into that situation. But all bets are off if they do get into it. You're going to come, no questions asked.
Fantastic, Bill. Well, thank you so much for all you do and for leading the way in threat safety science for us.
Thank you, and have a good day.
So what we'd like to close with today, as we always do, we'd just like to have Jenny Dingman, our voice of the patient, a mother, a leader, a safety leader, a quality leader, share her thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
What a great webinar today. So much information. Through the years as an advocate in patient safety, I have encountered parents who have lost children in college. This is a very sensitive subject, but it's also a very important subject. We need to really take care of our children, keep in touch with them. That first year of college is vital. These kids have never been away from home before, and things can happen. Always let your children know that you are there, that they can come to you for anything. And please, again, share these recordings with your colleagues, friends, and family. Thank you all so much for being here today, and God bless you.
So thank you, Jenny. We always appreciate your steadfast support. And as we always share with our teams, to encourage us and them, we've got to fight the good fight against failure to rescue. We have to finish the race. There's a lot we've got to do to get the job done. And then whether we win, lose, or draw, we've got to keep the faith, because really everyone is a patient and everyone can be a caregiver. Everyone is a student and everyone can be a teacher. And we want to thank you all, and we'll see you next month with the continued focus on our workplace violence and fraud systems. Thank you for attending today. We thought it was critical that we address the rising freshmen because of the enormous threats that our youth are up against. Thank you again, and thank you, Randy, for your live help today, and our speakers who had to pre-record.